Today is May 14th, 2015, and it is my pleasure to be talking this morning with Dick Benner, former director of Oregon's Department of Land Conservation and Development. Dick has also served as staff attorney for Thousand Friends of Oregon, as the executive director of the Columbia River Gorge Commission, and most recently as a senior attorney at Metro. I'm Anthony Lavenda, a doctoral candidate in urban studies at Portland State University. Dick, we are honored that you would be willing to sit down with us today. We are hoping to gather as much information as we can from the folks who were influential in forming and shaping Oregon's land use system. We are aiming to document the stories, anecdotes, and experiences of people who were involved back then, as well as to get your thoughts on how the system has evolved and where you think it might be headed. We encourage you to share anything you feel is relevant to this effort, so let's begin.
Sure.
As we begin the interview, I was hoping you could touch on your personal and professional relationship with Oregon's land use system.
I was in law school between 72 and 75, and the law passed in 73. I knew vaguely about it a little bit. I was taking a course on municipal governance, and George Platt, who was teaching it at the law school, told us that this thing was happening, but I was not close to it. I was a law student, so I didn't have time to run up to the legislature and pitch in, but I was immediately interested in it, and perhaps that course and a couple of others and a relationship I had with OSPRG, the Oregon Student Public Interest Research Group, focused me on planning first, and then resource management, and to some small extent the way cities work. And with Bob Stacy, who was one of my law school buddies, and I got involved with the Valley River Center, which was working its way through the city of Eugene government. It was a big regional shopping center, I guess a couple of miles from downtown, and there were many people concerned about what that might do to downtown Eugene. There was a private lawyer involved. Bob and I worked with him a bit, tried to develop some testimony related to what was happening in the state and the legislature. Not successful, of course. Valley River Center was built, and it had exactly the effects on Eugene's downtown that we feared, and that much of the state planning program, as it later evolved, was intended not to allow again, or at least to accommodate it in a much better fashion. So I also, you may know that before the land use law, legislation passed in 1972, I believe, establishing the Oregon Coastal Conservation and Development Commission. And while I was in law school, I was an intern for Professor John Jacobson, who recently passed away, a ocean and coastal law intern. And I actually got paid a modest amount to go down to Florence and follow the meetings of the OCCDC as they struggled to do a plan for the Oregon coast under the state law. And that was really sort of bedrock information and experience for me that I later used when I got into the overall land use program itself.
Could you follow up a little bit more about your experience with the Oregon Student Public Interest Group?
Yeah, I found law school to be a bit boring. So I went over to the Urban Memorial Union after about 4 months of law school and was thinking I can do something, that piques my interest. And I had never heard of OSPRG, but I saw a little office or a table, I forget which, in the Urban Memorial Union, and talked to the folks there. They said, they explained what OSPRG did. At that time, it was funded principally by student fees, and eventually that was terminated, and the funding is much more broad-based. But they listened to me talk and said, well, there's this, we're going to put you in touch with Henry Richmond, who's a staff attorney up at the Portland office. He comes down on occasion. And, you might be able to, you two might be able to work on a project you could work on. And that's really what got me started going over to the coast and observing the Coastal Conservation and Development Commission. And, I ended up doing an internship one summer with OSPRG here in Portland. and wrote a report during that internship summer called Why Not Classify Estuaries? And it was aimed at what the OCCDC was doing. One of the things they were supposed to focus on was protecting the health of estuaries. And oddly enough, when the OCCDC adopted the goal on estuaries that got incorporated into the statewide planning goals, it had a classification system for estuaries. So they saw some good thinking in the work that Henry and I did on estuary planning. So I had a lot of respect for the work that Osberg did back there. They were pretty broad-based. You know, some of it was consumer protection. Bob Stacy did a project on the state land board and protection of wetlands. It was really a great experience.
Would you say that was instrumental or a pivotal point to your later involvement in the Oregon land use planning system?
Yeah, I would say so. You know, it was the first time, well, I was young, just out of law school, but it was the first time, obviously, that I had worked for a nonprofit, a mission-driven organization, where the people were intensely passionate about doing what the job was, and how to become an advocate, really, how to use the skills that I was developing as a lawyer, writing and reasoning and all that, how I could use it as an advocate. Yeah, it was very important.
Okay. So Senate Bill 100 created a framework for land use planning across the state, as you know. Based on this legislation, the statewide planning goals were drafted to express the state's policy interest in local land use planning. Do you believe LCDC, the Land Conservation Development Commission, that was created from this legislation, acted correctly to ensure these objectives have been carried out?
Yes, I do, overall, certainly. And I'm not sure I was aware of it in the early days of Thousand Friends as we were getting our feet wet in 75 to 77, that we understood the wisdom of the department and the commission to put its early attention and resources into ensuring that cities had their urban growth boundaries and got them into place. And then protected farmland outside the urban growth boundary. That was the thing that they saw as of the utmost importance, and they devoted their meager resources to getting that rolling and in place as soon as possible. And I think that was, I realized it a bit later that was a very smart thing to do. So it could have gotten not necessarily a wrong track, but probably not the right track by focusing on protection of natural resources first. They could have started that way. And, when I think back upon what the program has accomplished, clearly the urban growth boundary and the protection of farmland outside urban growth boundaries is the linchpin of the Oregon planning program. So my hat's off to those people who made that decision to maybe let some of the other subjects like natural resources and geological hazards and even housing, let that go for a bit in order to get people getting that urban growth boundary into place. Huge effort and ultimately quite successful.
Can you recall some of the specific people or actors involved in getting some of that initial focus on the urban growth boundary or protecting farmland as the linchpin, as you called it?
Yeah. Well, I would say, the biggest struggle over an urban growth boundary was right here in metropolitan Portland. And Bob Stacy got the assignment. So Bob and I got assignments from Henry when we went through the door in September of 1975. So Bob will be able to help you out there better than I will. But Bob and I shared an office, so I often knew what Bob was up to. And it was an amazing undertaking. First of all, Metro was relatively new as well. and DLCD and LCDC were new. So these two bodies were eyeing each other and jousting a little bit about when to be assertive, when to accommodate, and whatnot. And that was fun to watch. It was also, it became the blueprint, really. That experience became the blueprint for urban growth boundary expansion, establishment in many other parts of the state, especially for the larger places like Eugene, Springfield, and Salem, Kaiser. But it was also unique, so it was clear that much of the experience was not going to be applicable to Boardman or Astoria or to a lot of the smaller towns. Jim Sitzman was deeply involved in that. The most amazing part of it was, how do you know where you have rural lands, but there have been commitment of urban services to those rural lands? You drive through them, and they're being farmed, and they appear to be in large tracts, and yet there's a sewer line running along the highway, or there's a community college that's been placed on the other side of that bunch of farmland. So that became the battleground. The metro position was, well, if there's any public investment in public services in the ground, that's got to be inside the urban growth boundary. And Thousand Friends argued, well, now wait a minute, that's not urbanized. And if you're saying that everything that's got a sewer to it is going to be, or a water line to it, is going to be inside an urban growth boundary, we're going to have these gigantic urban growth boundaries that go way beyond the need. And remember, Goal 14 says the supply of land inside the urban growth boundary, you have to demonstrate a need for it. So it's not so simple as just looking where the facilities are. So there was a titanic struggle over that between Thousand Friends and others and Metro, and the agency was young, worried about its viability, not wanting necessarily to tweak the tail of the metro area. So it was a tremendous give and take. And Metro ended up with a boundary much too big. It eventually filled it up. But that's one reason why there were no big boundary expansions for a long, long time of that boundary. And unfortunately, in hindsight, and this goes to the evolution of this planning program, there wasn't a very good understanding at that time, I think, about the importance of the way the land inside the urban growth boundary was going to be developed. Again, the focus in the early days was, let's get those darn boundaries in place. And the reason for that was because we want to protect the farmland outside. And, it didn't take too long before people began to understand that if you let the stuff develop inside the urban growth boundary any way anybody wanted it to, then guess what? You're going to use up the supply, and you're going to have to expand the urban growth boundary. So this was, I would say, one of the first great evolutions in thinking about the program as a whole. It's not just about doing this goal and that goal and that goal. Oh, this is organic. These things work together. And I credit Henry Richmond with the insight that, just a little aside to maybe fill out the picture, the program has been threatened from the beginning in the legislature, repeal or hobbling it one way or the other, or at the ballot box in an initiative. And there had been a couple by the time this is all getting started, and there was almost a certain promise that it was going to happen in the future. And the home builders, with the realtors and some other interests, people who had interest in the development of land, were either did sign on to finance those efforts, or were likely to in the future. And Henry had the insight that housing goal 10, this says that every city, Metro included, has a responsibility to ensure that there are opportunities, housing opportunities of all kinds, the whole range, for people of the whole range of incomes. Now, surely the home builders would be interested in the implementation of Goal 10 if that meant that it was going to make more housing types available, more opportunities for them. And Henry worked really hard on developing that relationship with the metropolitan and state home builders. And Charlie Hales, our current mayor, just about that time became the lobbyist for the home builders. And a relationship was established between Thousand Friends and the home builders. We did some cases together. We did some studies together. And the agency was not leading at that point, but they were definitely responsive to it. It didn't take them long to see the importance of this relationship politically, but also this began the evolution to paying more attention to the way land was developing inside the urban growth boundary. And probably the biggest thing that happened, I've forgotten the numbers now, but in the late 70s to early 80s, just in the metro area, this is where it was easier to generate numbers here, in part because of PSU and others who were available to gather the data. But when you looked at the land supply inside the metro urban growth boundary that was designated for residential use, what was happening, it was the average new parcel size was about 13 acres. Excuse me, not 13 acres, 13,000 square feet. And after the initial implementation by the local governments inside Metro to comply with Goal 10, and this took a while, it got down to about 5,000 square feet. And in fact, since I would say the mid to late 80s, slowly but surely that number has been coming down pretty steadily. It pops up every once in a while when economic conditions change. But that, when you think about that, how the land inside the boundaries being developed, that was a revolution, no question. And once the law got into place about that, and LCDC said, yep, you got to do that, yep, you got to do that too. You can't have a charter provision that says no apartments in town. Cities around the rest of the state had to comply with that. And that was really a tremendous change, late 70s, early 80s.
Building on this discussion, LCDC adopted 19 statewide goals, and you mentioned some of those that you thought were some of the most important accomplishments. Which goals do you believe have been the most important accomplishments, and which ones do you feel have been least important, and why would you say that is the case?
Yeah, well, I told you I thought that in the beginning, Goal 14 on urban growth boundaries, establishment of, and Goal 3, protecting farmland, were the most important goals in the beginning. And LCDC seems to have seen that, and so did DLCD. So I would place those at the top tier. I think the fundamentals of the program are that urban growth boundary. And not every place in the state has great cropland just outside their urban growth boundaries, but the Willamette Valley does, and Hood River does, and places scattered around the state. And that's really, those were the growth centers. Those where the threat of sprawl was the greatest, and that's where the program, has experienced, I think, its greatest success. Then I think Goal 4, the forest lands goal, became important, not so much in the metro area, but in other parts of the state, because some cities bump up against forest lands. It's a tremendous state resource, and getting it protected from what has happened in most forested areas around the state. California is a classic example, where timber companies, they overcut. In the 80s and 90s, they began to sell land off in small parcels to suburbanize it or ex-urbanize it or create ranchettes or little subdivisions. Thank goodness that Goal 4 was in place and getting enforced, in part as a result of hard work by Thousand Friends and Robert Liberty in particular. That got staunched early on. And had that not happened, it would have been a tremendous loss to the state of Oregon. And if nothing else, I think about two things that we've seen since then. forest fire. If you have houses scattered in the forests, you're going to have a lot more fires, number one, and fighting the forest fires is much more expensive. And then you think about something as simple, or not simple, something like high-speed rail. Think about putting a high-speed rail corridor through California, where there's no real adequate land use program, and there are houses all over the woods, all over the countryside. How are you going to get a corridor through that? Instant friends of this and friends of that arguing against the high-speed rail corridor. They don't have that problem in Europe because they don't allow the forests and the farmland to be divided into small parcels where people live. They can do that kind of thing. And I think Oregon could do it. If we ever got there, we could actually place a corridor through the forest. Not that you'd want to lose the forest land, but at least you'd have the opportunity to make a public investment in a rail system. So that was very, very important. Goal 12. Goal 12, the transportation goal, was asleep for many years. It took from some very smart people. This is part of the evolution of the program to see. It's not that people didn't right at the beginning know that development follows transportation infrastructure. Rivers, whatever, ships. Shipping, ports and all that, it's pretty obvious. But I don't know, it didn't manifest itself in the early days of the land use program, like, we got to do something about this. I remember a discussion that should have produced a better result than it did, which was freeway interchanges. You put a freeway interchange between Portland and Salem. If you don't take care of that, if you don't protect that interchange from highway development, you're going to, number one, you're going to blow out an area of farmland, you're going to sprawl. Number two, you're probably going to ruin that interchange because it'll get overtaxed, and then you have to expand it and replace it or something like that. So there was this area in the law in Senate Bill 100 called Activities of Statewide Significance. And it came from the ALI Model Land Development Code, a very well-conceived planning construct that this state never really implemented fully. And the first thing it should have done under that charge from the legislature is freeway interchanges, and didn't. And to this day really hasn't done very much about it. It's taken some steps, but it's not been an adequate focus. But that link between transportation decisions and planning decisions had been made, but it wasn't pursued appropriately. It took until the late 80s and the early 90s for the state agency, LCDC, and the agency to start seeing that we got to pay much closer attention to this relationship. And oddly, if the stimulus was not so much a bad transportation decision being made, it was air quality. So in those days, this metro area had a lot of air quality problems. They had, I can't remember, sometimes 50 to 100 days a year when they exceeded certain threshold particulates and certain chemicals in the air. And so the region was facing a mandate from the federal government to get a grip on this. And so wisely, the people who were thinking this through said, well, we're not going to be able to do it simply by controlling point sources. This is really, it's auto emissions. A whole bunch of it is auto emissions. Well, why is this happening? What can we do to reduce auto emissions? Maybe it's, link the land use and transportation decision. If you're going to invest millions of dollars in a transportation facility such as a light rail line, let's do the land use planning to ensure that there's going to be high density and a mix of uses near the stations, so there are customers to put money in the fare box to help pay for it. And so you get the use of your investment. And on the flip side, let's not put a big transportation facility someplace where we're trying to protect it for agriculture or forestry or natural resources or something like that. These two decisions have to be put together. So just before I went to DLCD in late 1991, The agency by that time had a big effort underway to adopt a rule that would implement Goal 12, the transportation goal. There was a kick, a real boost in this direction by then Governor Neil Goldschmidt, and he deserves a large part of the credit for seeing that the state agency, number one, needed to pay attention to this land use, transportation, air quality connection, but also it needed to pay more attention to what was happening inside urban growth boundaries. He essentially would say, forget about the farmland, that's already protected, you know. Make sure cities are livable, make sure these cities work, and God darn it, you land use program, you gotta help us do that. And so that was underway when I got to the LCD, and I was lucky to step into that position just as it was hitting the ground. And for me, personally, it was absolutely terrific because my background to that point with Thousand Friends, and at the Gorge Commission for that matter, was resource protection. So I did a lot of Goal 3 farmland protection. I did the coastal work at Thousand Friends. At the Gorge Commission, you know, it's mostly outside of cities. And I walked into this, and I got almost an instant education. I had some from Thousand Friends and paying attention to what Bob was doing, but I got instantly educated almost at DLCD about this huge undertaking. We had just started, and I became totally fascinated and absorbed by it. Particularly, you know, trying to establish a good relationship, a productive relationship between LCDC and the Oregon Transportation Commission, between our department and the Department of Transportation. And it's had its ups and downs, but I must say the relationship is probably as strong in Oregon now as a relationship anywhere in the country between the state's transportation agency and the state's land use agency, if there happens to be one, which they're rather rare. But I would say the work that was done under the TPR from that point on, say starting in 1992, when we were beginning to get funds from the legislature to make it all work, through to today, has been absolutely critical to the success of the program. So I diverge. Let's see. The coastal goals I would place maybe in the same order of importance. And you know, something that was lost on me for a while, and I'm not sure many people picked up on it, but we do certainly understand it now. The basic construct of the program, urban growth boundaries and protecting natural resources, working landscapes outside, works really well in most parts of the state, particularly where there are threats on the agricultural land just outside the urban growth boundary from sprawl because the areas are growing. Well, the coast is a different critter altogether. It's completely linear, really. You know, you got the coastline and the mountains and a little bit that can be developed and one highway. And that construct of urban growth boundaries and protecting farmland outside, it helps a little bit on the coast, but it isn't the best formulation for protecting the coast from sprawl, livability, and all the rest. So that's why the coastal goals became really critical. Estuaries, shorelands, beaches and dunes, the ocean, those bodies of water, those where the ports are, in many respects, those where the cities are. And the fact that you've got these three goals working, the estuary goal, the shorelands goal, and the beaches and dunes goal, stopped much of the excessive development that was happening on the Oregon coast leading up to the adoption of the statewide planning goals. So there's that. Then I would say third tier, goal 2, which is a process goal, kind of boring, but it established a couple of very important principles that were important in the early days. Local governments, you can't just do something and give it to LCDC and hope that LCDC was going to understand why you did it and find that, well, it's either good enough or it's not, and go back and do it again. You've got to go through this reasoning process. And you've got to demonstrate that you have considered that the urban growth boundary ought to be this big, or you're going to designate this area for low-density housing and this area for high-density housing. You've got to explain it. And the mere burden of having to explain and connect your thinking, the facts in your thinking, to some requirement someplace, that was a revolution. I mean, today, they don't do things like that in other parts of the country. You know, it's, well, what does Councillor Jones want? And so this together with the case law, the Fasano decision, some early land use cases, imposed that thinking and reasoning process early on. And boy, was that important. Goal 5, the natural resources goal. What a difficult time the state land use program has had implementing that goal. I was at 1,000 Friends when its first crisis arose. This was in the early 80s. The state was in recession. And cities and counties were beginning to protect their natural resources with varying degrees of avidity. Some cities and counties were very serious about it, and some couldn't give a rip, and then everything in between. But what led to the crisis is that some cities had their watersheds in the woods. And the forest lands, the woods, were often owned by private timber companies. Powerful force then in the state of Oregon, very influential. And so what was unfolding is that some counties were developing ordinances to regulate forest practices in their watersheds, or in some occasions habitat, eagle habitat, for example. And the industry just went crazy about that. And their argument, which was not a bad argument really, is look, we have a system of managing forest practices in state law, the Forest Practices Act. And now we're struggling to do what the Forest Practices Act says to do to protect an eagle's nest or to protect the watershed. Now, my goodness, now we're going to have to deal with 36 county ordinances, all different, regulating our practices. And we have lands in 10 counties, and it's going to be a nightmare, and it's just terrible. Plus, you're taking our property rights. So they went to the governor's office, and there was just a near explosion. And a work group sponsored by the governor's office and the legislature, I was on it, was assigned the task to see if we can pull this together. And the result was a set of compromises that changed Goal 5, backed Goal 5 out of any regulation authorizing any city or county to regulate forest practices, and essentially an overhaul of the Forest Practices Act itself, leading to a different makeup, so it wasn't so heavily weighted toward people from the industry on the board making policies, to specifying that new rules in the forest practices regulations would protect certain natural resources that would otherwise have been protected, maybe through Goal 5. And it was a very, I think, a very good set of compromise that probably saved at least part of Goal 5. And then slowly but surely, as the years went by, and there was greater emphasis on higher density and mix of uses inside urban growth boundaries, so we didn't sprawl and didn't go out on the farmland. Somebody started thinking, Mike Houck, a personal hero of mine on this, started to say, well, wait a minute. We can't have high density everywhere. There are important natural resources right inside cities, but starting with parks. But what about all those stream corridors? What about those groves of trees? What about the wetlands inside cities? What, are we going to develop those with apartments and condos? We can't do that. And he may have coined the term, somebody did, I would credit him with it, as green infrastructure. We got to start thinking of this stuff the way we think of sewer lines and water lines in schools. We have to provide it. And it's not just for the wildlife. it's for people. So if you want people to live in high-density housing, give them some place to find relief, give them some place to take the kids, give them some place to enjoy life. And essentially a mini revolution right there. Goal 5 suddenly was on people's radar. A little bit of money came down the pike. The agency started paying more attention. There was litigation. 1,000 Friends went after him, but another very, very interesting thing about Goal 5, which I think, in hindsight, should have been handled differently, to some extent, it had a philosophical problem. Here, it was not just protecting habitat. It was protecting historic resources, structures, places that have maybe nothing to do with habitat, and aggregate, mining, energy sites, all in the same goal. And it just twisted and stretched that goal, and it made it more difficult for people to grasp, more difficult for the agency to implement. So along the way, I think it might have been wise to separate the two of them, but they ended up being treated separately. There are a whole bunch of special Goal 5 regulations on aggregate that don't have any application in any other dimension of Goal 5. And historic resources became a real headache. There was a time when it looked like everything that was 50 years old or older was going to have to be inventoried and analyzed at huge cost to cities. And so there was a mini explosion over that, and the legislature stepped in and essentially, certainly weakened, to put it mildly, weakened the protection from Goal 5 for historic resources. And now there's an awful large dose of voluntariness, if you will, in the protection of resources. And I'm not really in a position to evaluate how well or poorly it's done. My sense is that it's done fairly well and better than a lot of other states that don't do anything along these lines. But it's been a tough slog for Goal 5. Let's see. Then Goal 9. Economic development. It was a little bit late to the game. Pressures from economic development interest finally got LCDC and the department to pay a little bit more attention to it. Once again, 1,000 Friends was probably on that game, maybe a little bit before the agency was, in trying to build alliances with businesses, in part to have business leaders recognize that it may be in their interest to be inside a city, as opposed to a greenfield on farmland outside the urban growth boundary, or at some freeway interchange on on farmland. So 1,000 Friends, Henry Richmond, I got to credit him with it, building alliances with business leaders that, come on, you can see this. This is the way it's going to be good for you. And those alliances were very, very helpful. Again, politically, in the legislature, fighting ballot measures. A lot of business leaders, John Gray, who would be the first champion who comes to my mind, but Tom Walsh, Walsh Construction, and a lot of others. They saw this, they understood it, and they fought hard. And they get some of the credit for defeating some of the ballot measures along the way. And, slowly but surely, it became clear that Goal 9, so there was this debate between some businesses and community leaders about you got to balance Goal 9 and Goal 14, So it's okay that there be economic development in manufacturing facilities, for example, outside an urban growth belt. This is a. You keep talking about this is a balanced program. Well, that's the balance. Well, ultimately, the agency came down right on that. No. Goal 9 is about economic development inside urban growth boundaries, not to the exclusion of rural development, but it's not about rural development no matter what. So ever since that realization, there has remained this tension between old economic development sites, old logging facilities, mills that are not in a city, that are out there surrounded by forest land or surrounded by farmland. What happens to them? freeway interchanges where the 4 quadrants are not inside the urban growth boundary. Are we going to waste them? Oh God, you got the facility right there. We could have a warehouse distribution center there. Those struggles go on today, but to some extent, it's more or less settled that the real efforts of state government to encourage economic development, to facilitate it, are focused inside the urban growth boundary, as it should be. But Goal 6 on air quality. Air quality, as I mentioned, was critical in getting the state and regions thinking about the relationship between land use planning, transportation, and the air we breathe. It wasn't Goal 6. It was state and federal law that really moved that agenda along. So, if somebody said, Benner, you got to repeal one of those statewide planning goals if you want the program to survive, I would probably repeal Goal 6. It hasn't really added much. And Goal 13, the energy goal, I remember thinking in the early days that this was going to help protect important energy sites in rural areas and actually protect them not from farming, not from logging, but from sprawl, from rural development that didn't belong there. It didn't really happen. There's an energy facility sightings council for big facilities like pipelines or power lines, things like that. It's pretty highly regulated by state and federal government, and I would say Goal 13 has almost been an insignificant factor in that, and I think it remains that way. So I've hit enough of them.
I was wondering, you keep on mentioning that, inside the urban growth boundary and some of the land use planning goals, like some of the issues that you might address in there. I was wondering if you could reflect on that a bit more. What you mean and what sort of issues inside the urban growth boundary that are either being addressed or were not being addressed, and how we have progressed over time.
Yeah, if you read through Goal 14, there was a part of it that got ignored in the early days, and I excuse it to a certain extent because the emphasis was getting the boundary in place and not so much how things are happening inside the boundary. But as boundaries got set and cities grew and boundaries were expanded, a question arose about the land that newly came into the boundary. This was a huge issue in the metro area because we added more land to our urban growth boundary than other cities did. What happens to that land? So, your urban growth boundary is supposed to contain a 20-year supply. So the development forces had the sense that, new land has just come into the urban growth boundary. Let's go! Well, actually, that's what you're adding is to the 20-year supply. This supply we have now is supposed to last 20 years. So which land do you develop? Do you go out to that neat new 300 acres that's in a nice large parcel? Boy, that would be easy to divide nicely. You could lay out the streets and everything. Very convenient and very efficient. But where are the supporting services? Or should you be concentrating where the density of your services lie and where you can most readily accommodate your needs, your housing needs? And it wasn't particularly clear how to sort that out in the 80s or even into the 90s. And it was, this problem was one of the things that communicated to the local governments and the agency that we need to pay attention on the land use transportation connection. In a way, as a placeholder for where are the sewer lines, where are the water lines, where are we going to put them, when are we going to do it, how are we going to sequence it? And if we decide it's now time to put the sewer line out to some of that land we brought into the urban growth boundary, so what's the density going to be? Well, you probably know that there is this planning school thinking that, here's how cities are. There's a central city, and that's where your big, tall buildings are. And that's where everything's really dense, and you have people walking on the streets, and your buses are and everything, and you have a radial bus system. And then there's the suburbs, and they're much lower density. There are split levels on cul-de-sacs and singing birds and children playing in the streets on their tricycles. And then there's the next level out, and that's where the rich people live on their little urban estates. And that's the way it's going to be. So that land that we brought into the urban growth boundary, that's what that's going to be. So let's put millions and millions of dollars into sewer and water out there for 1 acre and 5 acre parcels. And that was happening big time in the late 80s, early 90s, and that was one of the reasons that that led to rethinking about how Goal 14 was being implemented, and again, the land use transportation connection. And it was a great struggle to get there, and it's not over. It's definitely not over. But people, in a way, it has been a blessing that federal and state money to finance the extension and development of infrastructure began to dry up in those years. Because in the 70s, under the Clean Water Act, every local government, every regional government was getting, here's a check for $5 million to put that sewer line in, and hurry up and do it because we're worried about water quality. And the agencies, the federal agencies, weren't paying much attention to what effect that was going to have on development patterns. So these critical years of the 80s and 90s, when people were starting to put the pieces together, I would say we finally began to get it in the second half of the 90s, and even more so in the 2000s, that when we need to accommodate another 50,000 people, the first thing we're going to think about is where we can redevelop, we can do infill. The network of services is already there. We might have to increase the capacity a little bit. We might have to replace a small line with a larger line, but we've got the corridor, we've got the right-of-way. That makes so much more sense, particularly for the yield that you're going to get in property tax generation from higher density and mix of uses than going out into that territory that they added to the urban growth boundary 3 years ago. So Damascus, today, that was added to the urban growth boundary in 2002, I think, and it was supposed to accommodate 50,000 people, and that was really before the light bulb had gone on that funds for infrastructure were drying up. It wasn't just that federal funds were disappearing, that state funds were disappearing, no increase in the gas tax, to pay for roads, upgrades of interchanges or anything. But the tools, the public finance tools that cities and counties had used to build infrastructure were slowly but surely being limited or taken away from them by the legislature or by initiatives like limitations on property taxes. So all of a sudden, you look at Damascus and you say, who's going to pay for the water line, the sewer line? How can TriMet afford to put a bus line out there? Light rail out there? Come on, it's not going to. There's no money for that. That has had as much influence really on the growth pattern as the change in thinking in the state planning program and the change in policy. But in a way, it's a happy coincidence because now I think that the thinking of city administrators and city councils now has changed about the relationship between where the growth goes and where the infrastructure is.
Are there any land use policies, subjects, or topics that are missing that the LCDC should have addressed in the goals?
Well, there's a difference between should have addressed and should address.
Well, what do you feel?
LCDC would have had been prescient ahead of the rest of us to say back in 1975 when they were adopting the goals to say, we need a climate change goal. We need to build this land use transportation connection right now and be doing it right now as soon as we establish the urban growth boundaries. But we know it now, at least most of us do, and we should, the agency should have been on top of that maybe 10 years ago. But again, it's, they would have been leading, really leading. And, I should say, people were thinking about it 10 years ago even, not just in the state agency, but some other state agencies and the regional government. It's just been slow. Metro is working with the state agency now, implementing legislation that went through the Oregon legislature in the second half of the 2000s. Kulingoski's climate change goals and the mandate to the metro area to incorporate climate change and reducing greenhouse gas emissions through a combination of land use and transportation planning. That, we've got it now, but it's only a beginning. And most of this doesn't apply to other parts of the state for reasons you can probably understand. This region has more resources, it's more inclined to do it, it's got the database, it's got the data, it's got the facilities to do it, but we need to push harder on it, obviously. So there's that. I think I would strongly advocate for the metro model to be replicated, adapted to other regions around the state for so many reasons. This experiment in regional government here, which is, I don't know if you know this, but it's the only elected regional government in the country. And it has the power to overrule local governments on land use and transportation decisions, and it has done that regularly. It has the power to raise taxes. And it's been, in my estimation, a tremendous force for making this region, attracts people from all over the world to see, and so many people to live. It's one of the reasons it's that way. Well, it doesn't have to be completely replicated, and probably shouldn't be in other regions. But in this region, local governments work together. And that is not the norm in this country. It's not the norm in other parts of the state. Although, because of the statewide planning goals and the fact that sometimes more than one city are inside the urban growth boundary, there has been an inducement for Eugene and Springfield to work together, for Kaiser and Salem to work together, and some of the communities in the Medford area. There is that. But in the metro area, it's much more evolved and much more effective. And I believe the legislature and the state planning agency ought to figure out a way to bring that model to other regions of the state. The Bend region, all the metropolitan planning organizations should have it. And there are so many benefits from it that are procedural and administrative that are beyond the impact on growth management. It just should happen.
So changing gears a little bit, but still continuing. In 1974, LCDC and DLCD undertook an unprecedented public outreach and involvement effort in adopting the first 14 goals. Do you think this was worth doing? How, if at all, did it affect your thinking and views?
It was definitely worth doing.
Yeah.
You should talk to the people who went through it, who worked for the agency, and get them to say whether it was worth doing. Because it was, they were brand new. They, making it up as they went along. Didn't have models in other parts of the country to guide them, and I know it was very difficult and very taxing emotionally. But certainly, in hindsight, we are able to say that in the beginning, this was ground up. And I don't mean grinding things up. I mean from the bottom up. So this was before the statewide planning goals had been adopted and developed and adopted. So there was a lot of opportunity to share thinking, share ideas. People were encouraged to come forward with ideas. So I think the face that the new land use agency and the land use program presented to people was one of openness, one of receptivity, one of communication, one of concern. And you heard the 80 hearings around the state. I went to one of them when I was in law school at LCC. There were a lot of people. There were 100 people, and there was a talk given about what this is all about, and then we broke up into small groups and brainstorming. There was somebody recording everything we said, and I got the sense that, wow, I'm here. People are listening to me. This makes me want to think harder. I could contribute an idea, and I think it was just critical. It's a legacy of the program. You can always turn back to that as the touchstone when somebody says, this is some bureaucrat and LCDC dictating things from Salem. Well, maybe there's an element of that, but in the beginning, and there's still a strong element of this, this is about communities finding their way. And I think that's worth doing.
Yeah, so building on that, do you think Goal 1, citizen involvement, is considered which is considered by many as critical to the development and execution of Oregon's planning program? Is that goal still relevant today, and why?
Well, it's hard to answer that. I've thought about it, and I've spent many decades in the program, and I've often found myself forgetting about Goal 1 and reminding myself that I forgot about Goal 1. And if you go back to when, in the acknowledgement period, when cities and counties were taking up this cudgel and working to do their own plans their way, as long as they comply with the statewide planning goals, there was just a change out there. It was not the old way of doing things. You had to have a citizen involvement committee, and for a lot of cities, that wasn't the way they'd done it. They might have had a planning commission, probably did, but that was it. It wasn't about the citizens, other than the citizens on the planning commission. And now there were, neighborhood associations and all this, and wow, new way of doing things. And it would vary. The experience certainly varied from city to city and county to county about how effective it was and how those people felt about the involvement. But I know in many places, this became a training ground. Really, the participants, the citizen participants in the planning program, later went on to become school board members, city council members, planning commission members, legislators, governors, and it was their introduction to government. I mean, what other realm of municipal activity went through this? What an exercise in democracy and self-governance, and what a training ground for the elected officials who were observing this and having to absorb it. So in those days, no question that Goal 1 set things on a good course. And then the plans got adopted, and then the news story was, well, what happens over time? Should plans be updated? What if they're amended? How do you amend the plan? Well, suppose you amend it and it comes out of compliance. Who's watching? Who's checking? Are the citizens watching? Well, most of those committees, they got exhausted, they got turned off because the plan is adopted, we don't need it anymore. So there were years, I think, when Goal 5 was almost irrelevant. Citizen activists would come to the commission and say, you wouldn't believe what's happening in my city. They just disbanded the Citizen Involvement Advisory Committee. And some of those things were corrected as a result of Goal 1. But I think, again, I don't feel like I'm in a position to evaluate what happened in those doldrums when citizens were struggling for a voice on relatively minor decisions as opposed to adoption of the plan. But it remains important today. People struggle with how to revitalize it. Can you just say, okay, we're going to do more citizen involvement without some objective in mind? I think not. So when I get asked about, well, what would you do, Dick, if you wanted to get citizens involved again in their planning decisions? I would say, well, let's undertake something significant, something where they see a stake for themselves, mostly their neighborhoods. How is it going to affect their lives in their own neighborhoods, and get them involved that way? That's where if it were my job, that's where I would turn in order to bring citizens make them more intimate again with the planning process.
Some of the struggles that you mentioned, for example, over Goal 14, or some of those inside the urban growth boundary issues and expansion of the urban growth boundary to include new 20-year lands, maybe struggles over that development. Can you reflect, or do you remember any particular issues with Goal 1 or citizen involvement?
Yeah. Well, as you can imagine, people would, I'll use the example of urban growth boundary expansions and the increasing density and mix of uses of development of land, growth management inside urban growth boundaries. So many people in neighborhoods fear change and don't see many positives that might come from it, and they see it touching them personally by having an apartment next door to their single-family neighborhood. And they would think, goal one, well, everybody's telling me that that is the most important goal. So I'm going to go to a hearing and I'm going to voice my opposition to that zone change or that permit application for that 40-unit apartment there. And they're going to listen to me because goal one is the voice of the citizens. And then they would find out that no, that's not the way it worked. Yes, you have a voice and we are listening to you and we're going to consider what you told us. But the fact that you oppose this doesn't mean it's not going to happen. So one of the great struggles, certainly in the planning program, has been the infill and redevelopment and development of lands newly brought into the urban growth boundary in a way that was different from the settlement patterns that had already happened there in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. And goal one got kind of torqued in that process, because people would show up and they would think that they were going to stop the march of higher density or maybe the light rail line. There's lots of opposition now to light rail lines because they see it as a way of bringing in higher density and mix of uses into their single-family neighborhoods. I remember distinctly a hearing that Metro had when it was considering the 2002, 2003, 4, 5 UGB, all one big expansion process. And it was in Wilsonville, a big hearing because we were considering the addition of a fair amount of land at the south end of the urban growth boundary. And scores, if not hundreds of people came to oppose it. And a testimony would be something like this. It would be a mother, and she would walk up to the microphone with a child in hand, and she would talk about their lovely development right on the inside the urban growth boundary, but right on the edge. Low density, maybe 10 or 15,000 square foot lots on a cul-de-sac. And the urban growth boundary was going to be expanded on the other side of them, and it was going to be urbanized. And the first thing they would say, we moved out here to be away from the city. And I remember sitting there in my seat thinking, if you don't want any change or significant change, you probably should have bought a house in Irvington. If you move to the edge of the urban growth boundary, you're moving into a very dynamic land use place over a long period of time, perhaps. But the tensions there were palpable, and that's still part of the planning program. I'm not sure I fully answered your question.
I think you did, definitely. Thank you. So we talked a little bit earlier about the connection between state and local control, but how have the statewide planning goals struck the balance between state and local control that the LCDC intended in 1974? I was wondering if you could explain.
Yeah. Well, when I was reading that question in preparation for this, I crossed out LCDC intended and wrote in what the legislature intended. Because the balance was not developed or established by LCDC, it was established by the legislature. And to understand it, you have to understand the beginning, where it came from. And it was Senate Bill 10 in the late 60s. Senate Bill 10 was the precursor to Senate Bill 100, and it required cities and counties to plan. It had a set of statements in the legislation that were the things your plans are supposed to accomplish. And it set some deadlines. It positioned the state to come in and take over the planning if the city or county didn't do what it was supposed to do. Boy, talk about a draconian measure. Well, that did not work out very well. There were some cities and counties in the states that were already inclined to do the stuff on their own, and this was helpful to them to give them a nudge. But most places were not, and most places did not. And the prospect of Tom McCall moving into Bend and taking over planning, it wasn't going to happen. Plus, there was no agency to help local governments do this stuff and figure out how to do it. There was no real budget. There was no planning fund to give Bend $50,000 to get started. So Senate Bill, 4 years later, along comes Senate Bill 100, and that's the backdrop. So clearly, legislators knew that they hadn't struck the right balance between state responsibility and power and local responsibility and power. So it was recast. So the recasting of it was very much in favor of the state, in a sense, because if you know how states work, states have the power. Local governments are creatures of the state. The state creates cities and counties. The state gives cities and counties power. Well, the tradition around the country is states give land use planning power and authority to cities and counties. The state doesn't have a role in it. Well, Senate Bill 100 said, we're going to readdress that. And it was a big deal. So this is where, the balance was struck. And people talking about it, people would talk about it in ways that weren't really an accurate reflection of the actual balance that was drawn in the statute. And they created this notion that really the new statewide planning program, it has goals. We're working toward those goals, and we're going to get there. We're going to try to get there someday. But these are not laws, but they were laws. And so there was a soft pitch coming from some state leaders about this new planning program, and it created this sense in local elected officials that these were goals that we're going to work toward. And then along comes 1975, and they have force of law, and there's 1,000 Friends of Oregon out here ready to sue you, and on a rare occasion the agency might too, and come into a circuit court and say, Your Honor, Marion County has just adopted an ordinance in the farmland up in the hills east and south of the city, and they're dividing it into 5-acre parcels. But this brand new agricultural lands goal says, no, it's got to be preserved in large blocks for agriculture. These two things are incompatible. And LCDC was a little standoffish then because they were brand new, and politically, were they really viable? So we won that case, right? And suddenly, there was this sense among local governments, holy cow, we thought these were goals, these are laws. And people came to Salem saying, well, this wasn't the balance that the legislature intended, but it is the balance that the legislature intended. Now, the legislature didn't adopt the statewide planning goals. They adopted the law, but the law told LCDC what to do, and that continues to be a controversy today. But the other half of your question, I think, is, has the agency handled it well and the legislature over time? And I would have to say yes, I think so. If nothing else, Oregon has a statewide planning program today. Other states that have tried it, theirs have been repealed by the legislature, unenforced by the governor, voted out by the people, collapsed because they couldn't get the balance right. Now, right, I don't know, but this program has survived. And it's been supported by every governor since its adoption. It's generally been supported by the legislature, except for a period of years when John Kitzhaber was vetoing land use bills. But the fact that it's survived tells me that it's struck a good balance, and it's constantly readjusted. Every year there are 25 bills going through the Oregon legislature to tweak it a little bit. And some of them pass, and some of them are good, and they make good adjustments. So yeah, I think it's well struck.
Mm-hmm. Can you reflect a little bit on the feeling of the time at 1,000 Friends of Oregon and their connections with the LCD or with the local communities that they were now dealing with, and just some of your own personal reflection on that.
Sure. In the early days, I remember the young staff attorneys, Henry included, really, full of enthusiasm and passion, thinking we knew the law better than anybody else. And to some extent that was true, because we were in court. And you had to read the thing really carefully and think about it and then make an argument about it. So, if you think you're right, you better persuade the judge. So we were pretty self-confident, won a lot of cases. Most of them were easy in the early days because the law said X and the county had done Y. And we were not terribly sympathetic to the cries from local governments about the struggle they were in. Local planners, for example, they might have been just as highly motivated as the young staff attorneys at 1,000 Friends, but they were working for a city council or a city administrator or a planning director and their perception was, yeah, we got this new program, but we have a city here to work with, and we have our citizens, and we have all these interest groups that don't want us to do this. So cool your jets, man. We're going to take our time getting there, and here's 1,000 Friends coming in, blowing the trumpet and ready to sue you. So there was tension there, for sure, despite a commonality of interest. And same thing with the agency. I remember talking to the few early employees of the agency who, again, shared my view of what this was all about, my passion for it, and they bridled under the reins they had by people leading the agency, and I'm not saying this is necessarily wrong thinking, that, look, this thing's just getting started. We have a very small budget. There are only 6 of us here. We've got this entire planning program. We have to survive. The legislature's we have to go back to the legislature next year to get a budget approved. Okay, so relax a little bit. We're not going to go where 1,000 Friends is pushing us to go, all right? They may be right, but maybe it's best that they sue the agency. Maybe it's best that they should sue Marion County and let the courts say this is the way it has to be, and then we can go there. So there was quite a bit of tension, often friendly tension between 1,000 Friends and the planning community generally. It improved, of course. 1,000 Friends got a little more politically savvy, in part from going to the legislature, and trying to prevent bad things and trying to persuade them to do good things, seeing that, there's an art of compromise here, and so everybody matured, including 1,000 Friends and the planning community, and it's much better shape today.
You mentioned you and others at the agency shared a view of what this is all about, reflecting on the land use planning program. I was wondering if you can clarify what you mean by that, or what your feeling was at the time, what this was all about, and maybe how that's changed over time a little bit.
Yeah. Well, there's an evolution all by itself. That's been fascinating to watch. So what it's all about. So in the early days, it was the farmers, really. You'll hear this from Henry, I know. We wouldn't have a planning program today if the farmers, some of them, hadn't come to the legislature and said, we need your help. We're losing farmland left and right in the Willamette Valley, other parts of the state. There has to be a planning program. Sprawl is going to wipe out our livelihood. So it was about protecting farmland more than anything else. There was an element of containment of sprawl, but not everybody saw it. Oddly enough, it was buried in an obscure statute, Senate Bill 101, that was part of Hector's and the movement's package of 5 bills. Senate Bill 100 got all the attention, but here's Senate Bill 101 that says this is about sprawl too. But it was mostly about farmland protection. And so you get the urban growth boundaries in place, the farmland seems to be fairly well protected, at least it's in a farm zone, and we can argue about how well it's protected in a farm zone. But we got that done. So, okay, what happens next? Well, then there's a new thing. What about housing affordability? Boom, boom years in the late 70s. Housing costs escalating. Housing opportunities terribly limited by Zoning, suburban zoning. Where are people going to live? How can they afford the split level house on a 15,000 square foot lot? You know, school teachers and workers in town. So suddenly the program was, this is also about affordable housing. And Goal 10 and the Goal 10 efforts started getting compared around the country to other affordable housing programs. The one that was court imposed in the state of New Jersey, for example, well, how is that working versus what's happening with Goal 10? You know, and we thought maybe Goal 10 was better. So that was another great motivation, mission-driven thing. And the agency started to pick up on that. They did some hires and got people with expertise on how to help cities go through the agony of upzoning. And then transportation came along, and you know, this connection between air quality and transportation. Well, you know, one of the reasons we want growth patterns in cities to be denser and mix of uses is so that we can cut down on auto emissions. You know, it's, what is it, 32% of greenhouse gas emissions today, and probably even more back then. So there's a public health motivation for growth management. There's an air quality and an air purity, a visibility, an aesthetic connection. So that's what land use planning is about too. So suddenly, you know, your list of why are we doing this? Well, it's farmland protection, it's public health. It's what about enjoying your neighborhood? It's about livability. It's about protecting neighborhoods. It's about redeveloping tired suburban neighborhoods and enlivening them up, adding some life to them. It's about all of that. Now it's about climate change. Are we going to have a planet left suitable for humans? You know, it's about that too. And it's all of these things. It's about life, really. Getting a little carried away, you know, but it's all of those things. And you don't have to argue. You know, if somebody says, well, you know, we don't need an urban growth boundary out in Central Oregon where we're surrounded by sagebrush, because that's not farmland. Okay, there's an occasional cow that passes by, you know, but it's not productive. We don't need farming. We don't need an urban growth boundary. Well, wait a second. Do you people have neighborhoods? Do you want a transit system? Should people have a transit system if they can't afford a car or something? You know, what about livability? What about your ability to afford the infrastructure that's, you know, going out in every direction and it's hugely expensive? So advocates of planning and growth management got more arguments along the way and got better at it. And of course, the access to data has dramatically increased, and the access to modeling to show a community gathering the relationship between higher density and mix of uses and your ability to have green space nearby, or your ability to have a transit stop there. Or, you know, you like to walk to the coffee shop and have a grocery store nearby. Well, you need rooftops. You need customers. And if you're all spread out and everything is zoned for 13,000 square foot lots, you're going to have to drive there. Are you tired of traffic? You know, well, you know, we can help you there. You can help yourselves by planning a walkable community. Walkability is like the touchstone now, you know. So, huge evolution. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we touched on this question, but I'm going to phrase it anyways again, maybe to give you an opportunity to build more on what you were just talking about. How do you think Oregon's land use program in 2015 compares with what was envisioned 4 decades ago? I mean,
I would say, you know, allowing for the tremendous education that people who were involved in it experienced from 1974, let's say, or even 73 with the statute, through today. What is it, more than 40 years. Allowing for that, I think it's remarkable how close what we see on the ground here to what was in the vision that people either expressed or is embedded in the statutes that were passed there. Remarkable. You know, I would just suggest for people who say, you know, this is all, you know, we've gone way too far, way too far. You've got Metro sticking its nose in what kinds of uses are allowed in an industrial zone in Hillsborough. How did it come to that? But you go back to ORS 215-243 in the purpose statement there. by golly, it's kind of generally stated. It's not very long and articulate, but it's there. You can see they're talking about urban growth boundaries. They're talking about containing sprawl. They're talking about livability there. They're talking about protecting public investments and infrastructures. It's there. And that's what this is all about. So, livability. The word livability is used.
In what ways have prominent state and local elected officials, ballot measures, actions by Oregon legislature, and key court rulings advanced or undercut these original purposes of Senate Bill 100 and the drafting and implementation of the state planning goals? So thinking back a little bit on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's a lot, I know.
Yeah, there's been so much of it. I often find myself defending the program, not from people who want to do away with it, but from people who don't think it's done well enough. And I do defend it. I very much so. We've lost some ground in certain areas as a result of the ballot measures, particularly the property rights stuff. And we've gained ground through legislative acts and amendment to the rules. I think farmland protection in place today is better than it was 15 years ago. So it's part of the survivability, if you will, of the program that there have been steps forward, steps back, stumbles in the darkness, finding the light and moving in that direction. It's an unending stream, and I'm not an expert on what's happened in other states, but I don't think you can find an experience like this anywhere in the country. So much of what the legislature did along the way has been positive in the sense that we're getting complaints from people, from local governments. We need to make an adjustment, but they want to make it better. They want to make it work. They want it to survive. And some place along the 45-year trajectory, that became the motivation. Okay, there's a lot of criticism of this program, but it is really important, and it's a treasure, and we have to preserve it. Even many opponents of it say, no, we don't want to destroy it. We have problems with these 5 points. If we can just make a little progress there. And that's been one of the great stories of the program.
So kind of building on that, are there any changes or additions you'd like to see in the planning laws, or maybe some that those opposition raised, or in the statewide goals that would enable Oregon's land use programs to face the challenges of the future? You mentioned climate change as one of them, but maybe some others.
Yeah, well, I spoke a little bit earlier about how I would work with local governments around the state to use some of the metro model. Again, there's resistance, of course, to direct replication of the metro model anywhere. But there's so much in it that I think an impartial review of would suggest are very positive and could be applied in my area, even though I'm in Southern Oregon or Eastern Oregon or something. And that ought to be pursued. The way we have dealt with, Metro has dealt with protection of industrial lands, with transportation decisions, doing them with intergovernmental cooperation, making sure that there's something for all parts of the region and all parts of cities. There's much good learning there that ought to be applied in other parts of the state, and they would very much benefit from. I've also thought that, particularly when the planning program has been in trouble in several ways, one in particular when it's had difficulty getting money for its budget, and the agency has been under attack and wanted to figure out a way to adjust the program to save money. So I have suggested to the agency in the past that maybe the relationship between the state and Metro ought to be adjusted. And the model, not necessarily the blueprint, but the model would be the relationship that the state has with the Columbia River Gorge National Scenic Area. So the way that works is, inside the boundaries of the National Scenic Area, the statewide planning goals don't apply. Well, that's kind of interesting, you know? Well, that's because the Columbia River Gorge National Scenic Area Act is essentially a parallel piece of legislation. It has the same directives about protecting farmland and forest land. So if you're a local government in a national scenic area, how much would you like the new regime where you have to comply with everything the Gorge Commission is telling you to do, and you have to comply with everything the state LCDC is telling you to do, and they're not exactly the same? It's kind of a nightmare, and it's really expensive. So the idea is repeated itself in the metro area. The local governments, the 25 cities and 3 counties, portions of which are inside the urban growth, inside our urban growth boundary, have to comply with all of the metro regulations, and they have to comply with all the statewide planning goals. And it's not very effective or efficient. So my idea would be to, what I've recommended to the agency, is recast the relationship to be similar to what the Gorge Commission has. And LCDC would retain responsibility with Metro on any urban growth boundary expansion. But there would be an evolution so that Metro would stand in the place of the statewide planning goals. And then so cities and counties inside Metro would deal with Metro. It wouldn't have to deal with LCDC. And LCDC would be relieved of the largest burden they have, which is to make sure things work out well in Metro. Another model, that for this is what happened with Goal 5 and the timber industry and regulation of forest practices. They figured out a way to recast it, and Goal 5 essentially retreated from Forest Practices Act regulations, and it became a state function. So there are precedents for it, and I know there are some concerns that people would have about the statewide planning program not applying in the metropolitan region. And I think one way of addressing that, same thing happens with the Gorge Plan. There's a review every so many years by the state. Maybe it's 5 years, maybe it's 10 years. And they would do an assessment. Well, how are things working out in the metro area? Is Metro doing it right? And you adjust the relationship, perhaps. Something like that. But anyway, I think that would be a good change. I would also take up again what periodic review is all about. It's been a struggle to get it right. There have been changes, several waves of changes when I was director there, and legislation to adjust it. I think they were helpful, but I don't think it's done yet. And I would argue that it ought to be a much heavier focus in a periodic review that might be voluntary and incentivized as opposed to required. Leaving the required stuff being when you expand your urban growth boundary or amend your plan, but the actual periodic review of the competency, of the appropriateness of your urban growth boundary, of your plan, ought to be community development oriented, and the state should be the partner. State agencies should be the partner there. Money should come to the local government. State agencies should get any decisions they're making within that community should be done with the city. That would be my focus with periodic review. And it has evolved that way, but it's not there yet.
Are there any other thoughts, anecdotes, or experiences you'd like to share with us while you have this excellent opportunity to do so?
Oh, God.
Another small question for you.
Yeah. Didn't really think too much about anecdotes. Well, I remember in the early years of 1,000 Friends, and the Oregon planning program was the rage around the country among the planning community, and people were casting their eyes over to this thing. Is it going to work? Is it going to work? God, it really looks good on paper, And so so the staff attorneys at Thousand Friends were getting speaking engagements, all over the country to come and talk to LA or Baltimore about this amazing program. And, we were kind of puffed up about it. And often, the request for a speaker from maybe a nonprofit or even a government would be, well, we're not going to bring the agency people in to talk about the program because, they're bureaucrats, and they don't talk very good. And they have a certain view. We want to get a critical analysis, so they bring people in from Thousand Friends. And I remember being asked to talk to a group of city leaders and John Mosser, who was the LCDC chair at the time. He was on a panel. And I got up and did my impassioned thing, that knew no limits, and say, well, it should be this way, and LCDC should be doing more of that. And John Mosser followed me, and he said, well, Mr. Benner is quite the eager beaver. I remember that, and it impressed me that it changed my thinking of Mosser himself and the program a little bit about, what we're trying to do here is essentially remake development patterns that were, responded to the end of World War II and the interstate highway system and highway monies, and it got into place over 50 years. And we're trying to change all of that. And you've got to adopt your comprehensive plan after the statewide planning goals in 1 year. And it took 9 years before the plans were done. Okay, it's good to remember, that this is going to take a while, and you can only push it so far. And you got to think about how to be effective. Do you get up there and do a rant and point the finger and say, "You're terrible. You're not doing it well enough. You're not doing it fast enough"? Or is it, I'm here to help you. Let's agree that this is a good place to go, and we want to help you get there. Yeah.
Is there anything else you'd like to share?
Mm-hmm. Oh, you've probably got enough wind out of me.
Great, thank you so much. So, I've been speaking with former DLCD Director Dick Benner today. Dick, thank you for your perspective on the evolution of Oregon's unique land use system. It's been a real pleasure.
Well, I got a chance to talk.
Thanks.
Henry will take 2 minutes.